There's a question that lives quietly in the back of many people's minds. Not loud enough to say out loud, but persistent enough that it never quite disappears. It goes something like this. Why does this keep happening to me? You meet someone. Something ignites. There's a pull you can't quite explain, something that feels like recognition, like finally. And then slowly or all at once, you realize they can't give you what you need. They're not there in the way you want them to be. They're emotionally somewhere else, somewhere you can sense but can never quite reach. And you're left again in that familiar ache of reaching for someone who is always just slightly out of reach. So you try again. You tell yourself this time will be different. You look for different signs. You make different choices. You might even date someone who seems like the opposite of your usual type. Someone warmer, more expressive, more present. And for a while it feels different, but something is missing. The pull isn't there in the same way. And then maybe in that relationship or the next one, you find yourself somehow in the same place. Different person, same emotional distance, different story, same wound. Maybe you've decided it's bad luck. Maybe you've thought the problem is where you're meeting people, or the kind of environment you move in, or simply the era that everyone is emotionally unavailable now, that this is just what dating has become. Maybe you've told yourself, half joking, but not entirely joking, that you have terrible taste, that something is fundamentally broken in your choosing, that you're simply unlucky in love. But what if luck has nothing to do with it? What if the problem isn't who you're choosing, but what you're unconsciously looking for? That's not a small question, and it doesn't have a small answer. What I want to explore with you today goes underneath the surface of behavior, underneath the explanations and the excuses and the stories we tell ourselves about the people we attract. It goes into something deeper, something Carl Jung spent his life trying to name and illuminate, because the patterns in who we're drawn to, the ones that repeat no matter how hard we try to change them, they are not random. They are not bad luck. They are, in a very precise psychological sense, messages. Messages from a part of yourself that is trying to be seen. And when you begin to understand what those messages are saying, the pattern doesn't just make sense. It becomes something you can actually work with. Before we go any further, I want to pause and ask you something directly. What's one pattern in your relationships that you've noticed repeating, even when you try to change it? Leave it in the comments below. You don't have to explain it or analyze it. Just name it. Because naming something, even partially, even imperfectly, is already a form of seeing it. And that matters here more than you might expect. If this kind of exploration resonates with you, consider subscribing. This channel is dedicated to exactly this, going beneath the surface of who we are, what drives our choices, and what gets in the way of the life we actually want to live. Using the depth psychology of Carl Jung, not as an academic framework, but as a living map of the interior, like this video if it's speaking to something real in you. And now let's go deeper. The most common explanation people reach for when they notice this pattern is external. The wrong city, the wrong apps, the wrong social circles, bad timing, a generation of emotionally stunted people. These explanations are understandable. They're also ultimately not the place to look. When a pattern repeats itself across genuinely different relationships, with different people in different stages of life, under different circumstances, the explanation cannot be external. Because you are the constant, not as a flaw, not as a failure, but as the one consistent variable present in every single one of these encounters. This is not blame. Blame would be the easy, lazy reading of what I'm saying, and it would miss the point entirely. What I'm pointing toward is something more interesting than blame, and ultimately far more liberating. The existence of a pattern that operates below your conscious choices. A pattern that was formed before you had the language to name it, before you had any say in what it would look like. And a pattern, crucially, that can be seen. Because what can be seen can be changed. Think for a moment about how you experience attraction. There's usually something immediate about it. A quality in the person, a way they carry themselves, something in the energy of an early conversation. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like a discovery, like recognition, like something in you leaning forward before your mind has processed what's happening. That feeling of recognition is the clue we need to follow. Because what you recognize is rarely something entirely new. What you recognize is something familiar, and familiar in the language of the psyche, in the language of the unconscious, always points backward, towards something that already lives inside you, something that has been there waiting for a long time. You don't fall for emotionally unavailable people by accident. There is a logic to it, a precise, internally consistent logic, and when you can begin to see that logic, not to judge it, but to genuinely understand it, the pattern begins to lose its grip on you, not all at once, but enough to start breathing differently inside it. Attraction is not random, it's patterned by something you cannot see. Imagine for a moment that your psyche is a large house. You've lived in this house your whole life. You know certain rooms intimately, the rooms of your daily personality, your deliberate choices, your conscious self-image. You move through them easily. You've arranged the furniture to your liking. These are the rooms of your awareness. But the house is bigger than those rooms, much bigger. There are entire wings of it that you haven't entered in years, or perhaps ever. Not because they don't exist, not because they aren't yours, but because at some point, for reasons that made sense at the time, you stopped going in. Maybe the door was closed by someone else. Maybe you closed it yourself because what was inside felt too large, too strange, too threatening to the version of yourself you were trying to be. So the lights in those rooms went off, and over time you almost forgot they were there. Jung called the contents of those dark rooms the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we've pushed out of conscious awareness, not out of weakness, but out of necessity. The aspects of who we are that didn't fit the image we were building or maintaining, the feelings that were too much, the needs that felt too vulnerable, the parts of our nature that were never given permission to exist in the light. And alongside the shadow, there are other structures in the psyche, internalized images of the people who shaped us, archetypes that organize how we relate to love, to loss, to authority, to belonging. The entire interior of the house is populated with figures and forces that we didn't consciously choose and often don't consciously recognize. Here is where projection enters. And this is the mechanism at the heart of everything we're talking about today. When a part of your psyche that lives in those dark rooms hasn't been consciously recognized, hasn't been integrated, hasn't been brought into the light of awareness, it doesn't simply stay put and wait patiently. It goes looking. It goes looking outside of you. It scans the people you meet, the situations you find yourself in, the emotional textures of your encounters. And when it finds something that matches, when it finds someone who carries in their personality or their emotional pattern, something that resonates with what's unresolved in your interior, it locks on. This is projection. In Jung's understanding, projection is not a mistake or a distortion we can simply choose not to make. It is one of the primary ways the unconscious communicates with the conscious self. When we project, we don't see the other person clearly. We see through them, as if they were a screen, a surface onto which the unrecognized contents of our own psyche are cast. And what we call chemistry, what we call attraction, what we call that feeling of finally finding someone. It is very often the heat generated by that projection landing, by the unconscious saying, there, that one, that's the carrier. This is not weakness, it is not pathology, it is not something to be ashamed of. It is how the psyche works. It uses the external world, the people we encounter, the relationships we form, as mirrors for what hasn't yet been given an interior home. And the more unrecognized those interior contents are, the more powerfully the projection operates, the more irresistible the pull feels, the more it bypasses your rational judgment entirely. You're not just meeting them, you're meeting a part of yourself through them. And when that part of yourself hasn't been met internally, when those rooms have been dark for a long time, meeting it projected onto another person feels extraordinary. It feels like you found something rare, like something in you has woken up. What you're actually feeling is the pressure of your own interior life, finally finding a surface to push against. But you experience it as being about them. This is why reasoning doesn't break the pattern. You can list all the red flags in perfect detail. You can describe every way this person is wrong for you. You can receive the warnings of your most perceptive friends and still feel drawn with a force that baffles you. Because the draw is not coming from the part of you that makes lists. It's coming from something much older, much deeper, and operating from an entirely different kind of logic. Before we continue, I want to pause for a moment. Everything we are exploring here, I know it can awaken something, a desire to go further than a single video allows. I've been there myself, that moment when something clicks, when a pattern that has confused you for years suddenly has a name and a shape, and you realize that information alone won't carry you all the way through us. At some point, what's needed isn't more content, it's structure. A container for the actual work of going inward. If you're feeling that pull right now, there's a link in the description. Take a look when the video ends. Now let's stay with this, because we've just reached the part that changes things. So why emotional unavailability specifically? Why does this particular quality, this specific kind of distance, activate the projection so reliably in some people and not at all in others? The answer lies in the place where the pattern was first written. And to find that place, we have to go back to before you ever fell for anyone romantically, before you had any conscious idea of what love was supposed to look like. Back to the first relationships you were ever in, the ones with the people who were supposed to be emotionally available to you, your parents, or whoever occupied that role in your early life. Those relationships we saw, with all their love and their limitations, their presence and their absences, their warmth and their failures to show up, created a template. Jung called this the imago, the internalized image of the parent that the child carries into their inner world. Not a photograph, not a rational assessment, but an emotional blueprint, a felt sense of what closeness is supposed to feel like, what love moves like, what connection sounds like. And here is the uncomfortable truth about that blueprint. It doesn't primarily record what was good. It records what was formative. And what was most formative was very often what was most unresolved. If you grew up with a parent who was genuinely loving but emotionally distant, someone who was present in the house but not present in the way you needed, something in your young psyche registered that particular combination as the emotional landscape of closeness. Not because you chose this, not because it was pleasant, but because the child's psyche is above all else survival-oriented and it adapts to whatever emotional reality surrounds it. It learns that reality. It internalizes it. It calls that emotional temperature home. The people you desire most often carry something that belongs to your past. Not the same person, not the same face or name or circumstances, but the same emotional signature, the same particular quality of distance, the same specific ratio of warmth and inaccessibility that your nervous system learned early on to call love. And when you meet someone who carries that signature, even if everything else about them is completely different, something in you leans toward them with a recognition that bypasses everything else. What feels like chemistry is sometimes just recognition of an old wound. This is not a metaphor. This is, in a very concrete physiological and psychological sense, how the imago operates. The psyche goes looking for what it already knows, not because what it already knows is good. Not because it serves you, but because what it already knows is familiar. And familiar at the level of the nervous system, at the level of the unconscious body memory that was formed before you had language, registers as safe, even when, especially when, it isn't. This is why intellectual understanding alone is not sufficient to shift the pattern. You can understand all of this clearly, agree with everything I'm saying, feel the recognition as you hear it, and still, the next time someone with that emotional signature walks into your life, feel the pull. Because the pull isn't coming from the part of you that understands. It's coming from the part of you that learned this template before understanding was even possible. After hearing this, do you think you were truly choosing these people? Or being guided by something deeper? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave your reflection in the comments. And if this has named something real for you, if it's given language to an experience you've been carrying without words, a like tells me this is reaching the people it's meant to reach. There's also a link in the description for those who feel ready to take this further with more structure and depth. Now, here is where something begins to shift. There is a concept that appears throughout Freud and is deepened significantly by Jung, the compulsion to repeat, the psyche's tendency to recreate the conditions of its unresolved wounds. Not out of masochism, not out of stupidity, but because the psyche, in its own way, is trying to solve something. When you find yourself drawn to someone emotionally unavailable, one honest way to understand it is this. Some part of you believes, at a level far below conscious belief, that this time it will be different. That this time, the person who carries the emotional signature of your earliest unmet need will finally meet it. That the love you couldn't get then, you might finally get now. That if you can just do it right, try hard enough, be enough, the wound will be healed. The hunger will be satisfied. The pattern will resolve. It never works that way. Not because the people you choose aren't capable of love, but because the need that's driving the attraction was never really about them. It belongs to your interior world. It asks to be met internally, through consciousness, through the slow and demanding work of recognizing what's been living in the dark rooms of your own psyche and bringing it into the light. The dangerous comfort of familiar pain is that it feels like home. And home, however complicated, has a gravity, a pull. It keeps drawing you back, not because you lack judgment, but because the psyche is not primarily interested in comfort. It's interested in completion, in wholeness, and it will use whatever is available to try to move in that direction, including relationships that repeat the wound instead of healing it. But here is what begins to shift when you can see this clearly. You stop being a passive participant in the pattern. You stop experiencing attraction as something that simply happens to you, a force you can only obey or resist with gritted teeth. You begin to see it as information, as a signal, as the psyche's way of pointing towards something that needs attention in your interior life. And you can begin to ask gently, without judgment, not just why am I attracted to this person, but what are they carrying that belongs to me? What room in my own house are they holding the key to? This doesn't make the pull disappear overnight. I want to be clear about that. Anyone who promises you that awareness alone will dissolve a pattern that was formed over years isn't telling you the full truth. What awareness does is subtler and more real than that. It creates space. Just enough space to pause before you're already completely inside the old current. And in that pause, in that breath between the pull and the surrender to it, there is the beginning of a choice. Jung used the word individuation to describe the lifelong movement towards psychological wholeness, not a destination, not a state of arrived perfection, but an ongoing process of becoming more fully, more consciously, more honestly yourself, including the parts of yourself that have been living in those dark rooms. One of the most significant arenas where individuation happens is in intimate relationships. Not because relationships are the goal, or because you need to be in one to do this work, but because the people we're most powerfully drawn to often serve, whether they know it or not, as mirrors for the parts of ourselves that most urgently need to be met. The person who is emotionally unavailable, the one who triggers that particular ache in you, they are, in a real psychological sense, carrying something that belongs to your inner life. Some quality, some energy, some unresolved question that your psyche has been searching for a way to encounter. When you begin to withdraw that projection, when you start to see the other person as they actually are, separate from the story your unconscious has layered onto them, something interesting happens. The intensity of the attraction shifts. It doesn't necessarily vanish, but it changes in quality. It becomes less compulsive, less urgent, less like a hunger that demands to be fed at any cost, and more like information that's asking to be understood. Seeing clearly for the first time doesn't mean seeing without feeling. It means seeing with a witness, a part of you that can observe what's happening inside you, name it without judgment, and choose slowly, imperfectly, and with real patience, not to be entirely governed by it. The question you started with, why does this keep happening to me, is not a question that has an external answer. It never was. It is an invitation from your own psyche to go deeper than the surface of your choices, deeper than the explanations you've given yourself about luck and taste and circumstance, and to encounter something more fundamental, the interior world that has been quietly shaping your experience of love all along. This is not an easy inquiry. I won't pretend it is. It asks things of you. It asks you to look at your past without turning it into a prison, to look at your patterns without collapsing into shame, to look at the people you've chosen and who have chosen you, not as evidence of what's wrong with you, but as maps of your interior. Incomplete maps, but real ones. And here is what I can tell you from having walked this territory. The moment you stop looking for the answer in the other person and start turning toward what's been living in the dark in yourself, something changes. Not all at once. Not in the dramatic way we sometimes wish change would arrive, but in the way real change actually comes, quietly from the inside, like a light being turned on in a room that has been dark for a very long time. The pattern isn't your fate. It never was. It is your frontier, the edge of what you've been willing to see about yourself. And the moment you step toward it with curiosity instead of fear, the moment you say, I want to understand this, the pattern begins to lose the one thing that kept it running, your unconsciousness of it. You don't have to keep reaching for people who can't reach back. But getting there is not about choosing better. It's about seeing more clearly, seeing what you've been looking for through them, seeing what has been waiting all along to be found inside you. And all of that begins with a question you finally let yourself ask.